Carl Jung didn't see empaths as fragile souls destined to suffer. He saw them as sleeping giants, people who possessed an ability so powerful that society had to convince them it was a weakness. And when that giant finally wakes up, when the empath stops absorbing everyone else's pain and starts wielding their true power, something terrifying happens. But what happens when they finally stop absorbing pain and start mirroring it? Jung spent decades documenting a pattern that haunted his clinical practice. Patient after patient arrived at his office, carrying the same invisible wound. These weren't ordinary cases of depression or anxiety. These were individuals who had been systematically drained by the people closest to them. What fascinated Jung wasn't their suffering. It was what happened when they finally stopped suffering in silence. These empaths had spent their entire lives as emotional shock absorbers. Every family needs one. The person who feels too much, who notices everything, who carries everyone else's burdens without complaint. Jung called them the stabilizers of broken systems. They kept alcoholic parents functional. They made narcissistic siblings feel important. They sacrificed their own needs so completely that they forgot they had any. The cost of this role was invisible, but devastating. Chronic exhaustion that no amount of sleep could cure. A haunting feeling of being invisible, despite being surrounded by people who claimed to need them. And the suffocating identity of being the good one, the reliable one, the one who never causes problems because they're too busy solving everyone else's. But here's what Jung discovered that changes everything. This wasn't personality. This wasn't some noble character trait that empaths were born with. This kindness, this constant giving, this emotional availability was a survival strategy, a calculated adaptation to environments where being selfish meant being abandoned, where having boundaries meant being called cruel, where expressing your own needs meant facing rage or rejection. The empath learned early that their value was conditional. Stay helpful and you stay loved. Stop giving and you become expendable. So they gave and gave and gave until there was nothing left. Jung understood this wasn't virtue. This was trauma disguised as compassion. What makes this survival strategy so insidious is how early it begins. Jung traced these patterns back to childhood in nearly every case. The empath child learns to read the room before they can read a book. They become experts at detecting dad's mood from the sound of his footsteps on the stairs. They learn to sense mom's emotional state from the tone of her hello when she answers the phone. They develop psychological radar as a mechanism of safety. This hypervigilance becomes their normal. While other children are learning to play and explore, the empath child is learning to manage. They're managing their parents' marriage by being perfect, so there's nothing to fight about. They're managing their siblings' emotions by always being the peacemaker. They're managing their own needs by pretending those needs don't exist. Jung documented how this pattern intensifies over time. The empath becomes so skilled at reading and responding to others that they lose contact with their own internal compass. They can tell you what everyone else in the room is feeling, but they have no idea what they themselves feel. They've outsourced their entire emotional life to the job of regulating everyone around them. Every empath Jung treated could identify the exact moment when everything changed. Not a gradual shift, not a slow realization. A specific moment of betrayal so profound it shattered the illusion they'd been maintaining their entire life. Usually, it was someone they trusted completely. A partner who'd been cheating for years. A parent who weaponized their vulnerability. A friend who spread their deepest secrets as entertainment. The details varied, but the pattern was identical. The person the empath had protected most fiercely became the person who destroyed them most completely. Jung called this the activation event. The moment when the empath's pattern recognition abilities, which had been working in the background their entire life, suddenly became impossible to ignore. They'd known something was wrong. They'd seen the signs, they'd felt the lies, but they'd trained themselves to ignore their own perceptions because acknowledging the truth would mean acknowledging they'd been fooled. The betrayal forced them to see what they'd been refusing to see, and once they saw it, they couldn't unsee it. This is where Jung's concept of shadow integration becomes critical. The empath realized something that broke them and rebuilt them simultaneously. Their tolerance hadn't been protecting anyone, it had been enabling abuse. Their kindness hadn't been healing damaged people, it had been allowing damaged people to avoid consequences. What Jung observed in session after session was a specific sequence of realizations that empaths experienced during activation. First came the shock of betrayal, then came the replay. The empath's mind would scroll back through years of interactions, and suddenly patterns that had been invisible became obvious. The times their concerns were dismissed as paranoia were actually moments when they were seeing clearly and being gaslit. The times they were told they were too sensitive were actually moments when their accuracy threatened someone's lies. This replay phase is excruciating, but essential. Empaths aren't broken, they're alchemists in progress. The Alchemist's Path gives you drills, Jung-based boundaries, and 3 exclusive chapter videos to turn overwhelm into clarity. By Surreal Mind, 236-page downloadable ebook, in stock. Begin now at thesurrealmind.com. The empath watches their own life like a movie, where they finally understand the plot. They see how they were trained to doubt themselves. They recognize the moments when they silenced their truth to keep the peace. They understand with brutal clarity how their gift of perception was weaponized against them and turned into a source of shame. The narrative shifted. This wasn't about being a victim anymore. This was about waking up from a lifetime of psychological manipulation. The empath had been asleep, and now they were terrifyingly awake. Jung documented something that most people completely misunderstand about empaths. Their ability to read people, to sense emotions, to perceive hidden dynamics isn't mystical or supernatural, it's data processing. Advanced pattern recognition that operates at a level most humans never develop. Empaths notice micro-expressions that flash across faces for fractions of a second. They track tone inconsistencies that reveal concealed emotions. They feel the energetic shift when someone enters a room carrying rage they're pretending isn't there. They've been collecting this data their entire lives, building psychological profiles of everyone around them without consciously realizing what they were doing. The difference after activation is that they finally trust what they're seeing. Before the snap, an empath would walk into a room and sense that 2 people who claimed to be friends actually hated each other. But they'd dismiss that perception as paranoid or judgmental. After activation, they trust it, and they're almost never wrong. Jung described a case that perfectly illustrates this power. An activated empath walked into a family gathering where everyone was performing normalcy. Pleasant conversations, polite smiles, the choreographed performance of functional relationships. Within 10 minutes, she could identify which marriages were dying, who was hiding addiction, who was stealing money, and who was planning to abandon the family entirely. She didn't confront anyone. She didn't cause drama. She simply observed. And her presence made the liars deeply uncomfortable because some part of them knew they'd been seen. Not suspected. Seen. The activated empath had become a living lie detector in a room full of people whose relationships depended on maintaining lies. Jung noticed something else in his sessions with activated empaths. They developed what he called perceptual layers. They could simultaneously track what someone was saying, what their body language was communicating, what emotions were leaking through their carefully controlled facade, and what deeper psychological pattern was driving the entire interaction. Most people can barely track the surface conversation. The activated empath is reading 4 levels deep while appearing to simply listen. This multi-layered perception is what makes activated empaths seem almost supernatural to those around them. They'll respond to the unspoken subtext while others are still processing the surface message. They'll address the real issue before it's been articulated. They'll name the dynamic that everyone else is pretending doesn't exist. This is why activated empaths become dangerous. Not to healthy people, not to authentic relationships. They become dangerous to manipulators, narcissists, and anyone whose power depends on keeping empaths confused about reality. The manipulator's entire toolkit stops working. Gaslighting fails because the empath now trusts their own memory and perception absolutely. Guilt trips fail because the empath understands the difference between genuine responsibility and manufactured obligation. Love bombing fails because the empath can distinguish between authentic affection and strategic performance. The activated empath stops reacting emotionally and starts responding strategically. This shift terrifies people who were accustomed to controlling them through emotional manipulation. Where they once found a person who would absorb rage and return apologies, they now encounter someone who simply reflects their behavior back to them without absorbing anything. Jung called this the mirror effect. The activated empath becomes a perfect psychological mirror. When someone approaches them with manipulation, the empath doesn't engage with the content of the manipulation. They reflect the pattern itself, not with cruelty, not with revenge, with clinical precision that exposes the manipulator's tactics without the empath losing their center. A narcissist tries to provoke guilt. The old empath would have apologized and tried harder. The activated empath names the tactic. You're attempting to make me responsible for your emotions, so you can avoid responsibility for your behavior. I won't be participating in that dynamic. The manipulation dies on contact because there's nothing to manipulate. The empath has removed themselves as a target. Jung documented how this mirror effect creates a fascinating phenomenon in social systems. The activated empath doesn't have to do anything aggressive or confrontational. Their simple refusal to absorb dysfunction causes the entire system to reorganize. Family members who relied on the empath to regulate their emotions are forced to develop their own emotional regulation. Friends who use the empath as a dumping ground have to find healthier ways to process their problems. Romantic partners who exploited the empath's tolerance have to either become better people or find a new target. The activated empath becomes a catalyst for collective growth simply by maintaining boundaries. Jung called this the purification effect. When one person stops enabling toxicity, everyone connected to them must either evolve or reveal their true nature. Both outcomes serve the empath's highest good. This is the power that empaths spent their lifetime suppressing, not the power to feel deeply. They never stopped feeling deeply. The power to act on what they perceive without needing permission, without seeking approval, without apologizing for seeing clearly. But activation without integration is dangerous. Jung understood that an empath who simply weaponizes their abilities becomes the very thing they once suffered under. The final stage isn't about becoming cold or cruel. It's about becoming a warrior who chooses when and how to deploy their power. This is where Jung's concept of individuation becomes essential. The individuated empath has integrated their shadow. They've acknowledged their own capacity for manipulation, cruelty, and selfishness. Not to indulge those qualities, but to recognize them as part of the complete self. This recognition is what allows them to use their power ethically. They understand the difference between nice and kind. Nice is weak. Nice is people-pleasing disguised as virtue. Nice is conflict avoidance that enables harm. Kind is strong. Kind is choosing to be gentle from a position of power rather than from a position of fear. Kind is voluntary, boundaried, and sustainable. Jung wrote about patients who completed this integration process. They became people who were incredibly gentle with those who deserved gentleness and absolutely unmovable with those who didn't. They could offer compassion without sacrificing themselves. They could see manipulation without becoming manipulative. They possessed the wisdom to know when to extend mercy and when to enforce consequences. The integration phase requires empaths to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves. They must acknowledge the times they used their empathy manipulatively, the times they played the martyr to gain sympathy, the times they remained in toxic situations not because they couldn't leave, but because being the victim gave them an identity they weren't ready to release. Jung insisted on this shadow work because he knew that unintegrated empaths could become the most sophisticated manipulators. They understand human psychology deeply enough to exploit it. They can read people accurately enough to know exactly which buttons to push. Without ethical integration, an activated empath could cause devastating harm. But when the shadow work is complete, something remarkable emerges. The individuated empath is terrifyingly capable of harm, but chooses peace. Not because they're afraid of conflict, not because they're trying to be good, because they've touched their own capacity for destruction and chosen to build instead. That choice, made from genuine power rather than learned helplessness, is what makes them psychologically invincible. Now we reach the moment that Jung documented as the ultimate transformation. The activated and integrated empath arrives at a psychological state that most people never achieve. They no longer need external validation, not because they've become arrogant or isolated, because they've developed such complete trust in their own perception that other people's opinions of them become irrelevant data rather than threats to their identity. Think about what this means. Your entire life, you measured your worth by whether others approved of you. You modified your behavior based on what would make people comfortable. You silenced your truth to avoid being called difficult. Every choice was filtered through the question of how others would respond. The activated empath asks a different question. Is this true? Is this aligned with who I am? Does this serve my growth, or does this serve someone else's comfort at my expense? They become psychologically invincible because there's no external approval they need badly enough to betray themselves to obtain it. Manipulators hate this. Narcissists can't function around this. Controllers become impotent in the presence of this because all their power was borrowed from the empath's need to be accepted. Remove that need and the entire power structure collapses. Jung documented how this shift creates a ripple effect that extends far beyond the individual empath. When someone becomes truly sovereign, immune to manipulation through their complete self-trust, they give everyone around them permission to do the same. Other empaths see what's possible and begin their own activation journey. Healthy people feel safe being authentic because there's no performance required. Toxic people either transform or leave because their tactics no longer work. The individuated empath becomes what Jung called a bearer of consciousness. They hold a level of psychological awareness that elevates entire communities simply through their presence. They don't preach or lecture. They demonstrate through their unwavering commitment to truth what human beings become when they stop betraying themselves. Jung watched this transformation and understood something profound. The empath's breaking point was actually their healing point. The moment they thought they were falling apart was the moment they were finally falling into place. Every relationship that ended, every person who left, every door that closed, was removing exactly what needed to be removed so the real work could begin. Your snapping point wasn't a breakdown. It was a breakthrough. The person you were before, the one who absorbed everyone's pain and took responsibility for everyone's feelings and made yourself small so others could feel big, that person had to die so the real you could emerge. And the real you is more powerful than you were ever allowed to know. Jung documented this over and over The empath who finally says enough doesn't become bitter. They become free. They don't lose their ability to love. They gain the ability to love from wholeness rather than from wounds. They don't become cold. They become warm in ways that are sustainable because they're finally giving from overflow instead of from depletion. This transformation isn't always celebrated. Jung noted that empaths often face intense resistance during their activation phase. Family members accuse them of changing, of becoming selfish, of thinking they're better than everyone else. What these critics are really saying is that the empath has stopped enabling their dysfunction, and they're angry about losing their emotional crutch. Friends who benefited from one-sided relationships suddenly discover the empath is no longer available for endless crisis management. Romantic partners who relied on the empath's tolerance for bad behavior find themselves facing consequences for the first time. The accusations fly. You've become cold. You've lost your compassion. You're not the person I knew. And the activated empath's response is profound in its simplicity. You're right. I'm not the person you knew. That person was performing a role that nearly destroyed me. This person is who I actually am. And if you can't love the real me, you never loved me at all. You loved what I could do for you. This is your inheritance. This power you've been suppressing your entire life because people told you it was too much. Because you learned that seeing clearly made others uncomfortable. Because you discovered early that your sensitivity was weaponized against you instead of honored as the gift it actually is. You were never broken. You were never too sensitive. You were never the problem. You were a giant who was taught to believe you were small, and every person who benefited from your smallness will resist your growth. Let them. Their resistance is proof that you're moving in the right direction. The activated empath doesn't need to announce their transformation. Others feel it. The same people who once felt safe dumping their emotional chaos on. You now feel nervous in your presence. Not because you've become mean, because you've become clear. And clarity is terrifying to people whose survival depends on keeping you confused. Jung's final insight about activated empaths was this. They become the ones who change entire systems simply by refusing to participate in dysfunction. One person who stops absorbing toxicity forces everyone around them to either grow or reveal themselves. Families restructure. Friendships recalibrate. Workplaces shift, not through confrontation, through the simple, unwavering presence of someone who will no longer betray themselves for the comfort of others. You're not activating a power you don't already possess. You're removing the blocks to a power that's been there all along. Every time you were told you were too sensitive, that was someone trying to convince you that your superpower was a weakness. Every time you were called selfish for having boundaries, that was someone trying to maintain access to you without reciprocity. Every time you were made to feel guilty for your perceptions, that was someone attempting to gaslight you out of trusting the truth you could see clearly. The switch is flipping. You feel it. That's why you're here. That's why this message found you at this exact moment. You're in the activation phase, and part of you is terrified because you're becoming someone the old you wouldn't recognize, someone who doesn't apologize for existing, someone who doesn't shrink to make others comfortable, someone who can finally wield the power they've spent a lifetime suppressing. Jung would tell you this. The empath's journey isn't from sensitivity to numbness. It's from unconscious absorption to conscious choice. You don't lose your empathy. You gain sovereignty over it. You become not less feeling, but perfectly feeling. Not less caring, but impeccably discerning about who deserves that care and who has simply been exploiting your inability to say no. This activation isn't the end of your empathic abilities. It's the beginning of their proper use. Before activation, your empathy controlled you. After activation, you control your empathy. You can turn it on when it serves. You can turn it off when it doesn't. You can extend compassion to those who reciprocate and withdraw it from those who exploit. This selective empathy isn't cruelty. It's wisdom. Jung observed that fully activated empaths develop what he called conscious boundaries. These aren't walls built from fear, they're gates operated from power. The empath decides who gets access and who doesn't. They decide when to engage and when to withdraw. They decide which relationships deserve investment and which ones deserve termination. This level of autonomy feels foreign at first because empaths spent their entire lives with everyone else, controlling the terms of engagement. Other people decided when the empath's time and energy would be available. Other people determined what was acceptable to ask for. Other people set the rules and the empath just complied. Not anymore. The activated empath writes their own terms, and the people who truly love them celebrate this transformation, while the people who are using them rage against it. This is the moment. The giant is waking up. And when empaths finally step into their power, when they stop playing small and start operating from their truth, they don't just change their own lives. They become the catalyst that forces everyone around them to evolve or exit. Both outcomes serve your highest good. In The Alchemist's Path, perception training for empaths, you'll turn overwhelm into wisdom with practical drills, Jung-inspired boundaries, and step-by-step perception training. This guide includes 3 exclusive chapter videos to deepen each lesson. Written by Surreal Mind, 236 pages, beautifully designed 8.5 by 11 downloadable ebook, in stock now. Start your training today. Feel deeply while thinking clearly. Get The Alchemist's Path at thesurrealmind.com. Thanks for watching. See you in the next dimension.